ठीक आ रहा है यार। हो गया सर आपका वीडियो ना। बोलिए। Hello, good afternoon, Paul.
Hey, hello. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. We are just about to start the meeting, waiting for a very few more participants who are about to join.
Great. Happy to be with you. Are you going to be able to project the PowerPoint, or are we doing this without it?
A PowerPoint presentation would be better, but it's okay. Wait a moment.
Okay.
हमारे पास है उनका। हम सोचे वो शेयर करेंगे। जब नेक्स्ट करेंगे तो नेक्स्ट करिए ना। तो मैं किसको हम हमारे साथ आराम से इतने लोग जुड़ गए हैं। हो गया ना शुरू करिए और कुछ आना। पहले मेरा सबको स्वागत करते हैं। म्यूट कहाँ है अनम्यूट कहाँ है सर नीचे हमारी बात है आराम से सबका स्वागत। हाँ यहाँ से आपका चालू है सर वीडियो का। Okay, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of INBIX ADNAT Organizing Committee, I welcome you all for this presentation and storytelling of Paul Slopek, a globetrotter, a storyteller, and a modern-day explorer. A two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Paul has journeyed through countless landscapes, cultures, and histories. Slopek received a degree in environmental biology from University of California, Santa Barbara. Slopek has reported globally for the Chicago Tribune, Foreign Policy, the Atlantic, National Geographic Magazine, and many other publications. He has traveled to more than 50 countries and earned most of America's top print media awards, including Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on human genetics and civil war in Congo. In January 2013, Slopek founded the nonprofit organization Out of Eden Walk, originally projected to be a 7-year walk along one of the routes taken by early humans to migrate out of Africa, which is still ongoing. He is currently walking across the world for a decade-long storytelling project called the Out of Eden Walk. He has walked with hundreds of local people along the route thus far, who are hired not as guides, but as walking partners. Paul will tell more about his exciting journey in his talk now. I welcome Paul on behalf of organizing committee of INVIX ADNET 2024. And for any questions, please raise hands or type in the chat box. Over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's great to be with you. I was in Varanasi once before, but on foot last time, walking across northern India, almost 4,000 kilometers over the course of about 17 months of walking. So I think the way to do this, if it's okay with you, is I'll just, go through this slide presentation. I'll ask you to advance it when I'm ready. And there's like a dozen images, so this will be fairly quick. And I'll outline the nature of this project, which is based on science, and it's based on human genetics and population distributions in the Pleistocene. And then at the end, hopefully there'll be time for a few questions if anybody has them. So yes, so I'm Paul, and I'm talking to you from South Korea, where I've walked since leaving India back in 2013. So what is that? That's like almost 6 years of walking, right? Through India and Burma and China and South Korea and into Japan. And then I'll taking a ship from Japan to Alaska, and then walking down the western side of the American continent to the tip of South America, which is one of the corners of the continents, as you all know, that was last reached by our ancestors who dispersed out of Africa sometime between 60 and 150,000 years ago. Uh, when I was walking into India, I was coming from Ethiopia. And so if you put my entire project together, and I guess we could advance one slide. So this is what I was saying. This is an old, actually now dated map. Some of you will notice that the dates are kind of old. But basically, this is more or less the routes, the proposed routes of human dispersal out of Africa. And these are the people that I'm following, of course. And so next image. Nobody knows, of course, who these folks were, early anatomical modern humans. Actually, in my experience, um, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a, I got a degree in biology, but I'm not a specialist in genetics. But from the experts that I interview, the paleoanthropologists, the archaeologists, we don't really know too much about early anatomical modern humans. We have some of their material culture left behind. We've got some fossil remains, but we can only conjecture, right, about things like culture. The closest match in terms of ancient genomes, in case of really old gene markers in existing human populations, probably includes populations of the San people in southern Africa. And this is an image of some San hunter and gatherers, probably in the Kalahari Desert. They seem to have some of the oldest gene markers in their genome, more than 100,000. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's hearing me. So can somebody say something?
We are sorry for, I think we lost the internet connection. We are just starting.
Okay, no problem.
I think it might be visible now.
Yeah, that's it. So I don't know where I last left off, but basically, I'm following the first anatomically modern humans, not exact routes, of course, because nobody knows, but basically corridors of dispersal out of Africa back during the Pleistocene, between 60,000 and 150,000 years ago. And as I was saying, that nobody really knows much about their culture. The genome, current population genome that has their kind of the oldest gene markers among living populations are the San people in South and Southern Africa. And that's an image of these folks here. You could advance one image. Yeah, thank you. So what I'm doing is I'm going to try to kind of retrace their journeys. So I started in Ethiopia in 2013. And as I mentioned, I'm in South Korea right now. I was originally planning to walk through Siberia and then kind of go over as close as possible to the land bridge, the Beringia land bridge, right, which once united Siberia with North America, and then walk all the way down to the tip of South America to Chile and Argentina, basically the Beagle Channel, where Charles Darwin did his work, and and then basically call that the finish line, right? One of the last corners of the continents that were reached by our ancestors on foot. This project was initially envisioned to take 7 years of walking. I'm now in year 12. So the world's simply too interesting because I stop a lot to talk to people along the way and tell stories. Next image. So this is near the starting line. This was actually on a pre-walk research trip to the Turkana Basin. I was staying at the camp of Meve Leakey, of the Leakey family, and was using her knowledge and contacts to kind of scope out this landscape to see how walkable it was. And these folks are pastoral nomads. And of course, when I went to start the walk, I was moving with people like these who maintain a pastoral lifestyle, pushing camels around, right? Not true nomads, pastoralists, transhumans. I started my walk in the Rift Valley of Ethiopia at an ancient site called Hertoburi, which is one of the oldest, pretty solidly dated, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Tim White and his team did the work there, and they date it to about 156,000 years ago. So that was kind of the symbolic starting line of my walk. Next image. So what do you do? The ancient people carried standard stone toolkit, bone tools, wooden tools, were very portable. And so what do you do today? Since I'm a journalist, I had to carry basically an electronic office on my back. This was my initial kit when I was leaving Ethiopia. And you can see it's quite a lot, even including satellite phones, which aren't really that necessary today because so much of the world is wired through mobile towers. All this weighed quite a few kilos, and I'm thankful that this technology is in the direction of miniaturization. So basically, united all these platforms onto a smartphone, which I use to record video and photos and audio, and then I use a very lightweight laptop to write the stories. So my office in my pack has gotten much lighter over the years. Next image. Within the first weeks of setting out from Ethiopia to retrace this ancestral trail across the world, I met my first modern migrants, and it's a rather tragic story. People who are walking out of Africa even today, ironically, along the same pathways that our ancestors took back in the Stone Age, are increasingly climate change migrants. People who are fleeing drying environments and failing farms, and who have no other recourse, having been pushed by hunger, to seek survival elsewhere. Right. This is part of an old pattern. Not much has changed in that respect. We're pushed and pulled by our bellies, our empty bellies, and these gentlemen are Ethiopian migrants headed for Saudi Arabia across these burning deserts in Ethiopia. They're hoping to work as basically manual laborers. This area was extremely dry, very little water, and I'm very sad to report that my party came across the bodies of migrants who did not make it. It's one of the many told tragedies of migration today. Next image. These folks, nobody knows really exactly how many people are voting with their feet, are moving out of Africa on foot along this particular corridor. Now, keep in mind, this is not the corridor that goes north across the Sahara Desert to Europe. That's a different route. This is the route that goes from the Horn of Africa, basically northeastern Africa, into the Middle East. And this is the beach in the country called Djibouti that faces the Gulf of Aden. And across this water, across this little stretch of sea, is Yemen, which back then was not totally engulfed in civil war as it is today. So many of these folks were going to Yemen, others are going to Saudi Arabia, some are going to Dubai, others to Jordan. And it was just heart-cracking. It was heartbreaking to see what they were being forced to leave behind on the beach by people smugglers, basically pirates operating open boats, carrying these migrants across the waters. These are their personal possessions: water bottles, backpacks, shoes, clothing, address books. This whole beach was littered with the personal effects of these people on foot. Next image. Further along, to keep the theme of migration going, ancient migration, modern migration, as I inched my way up through Saudi Arabia, and as some of you might know, the recent kind of palynological data and archaeological data suggest that Saudi Arabia, which is hyper-arid today, back during the period of kind of the Middle Stone Age, was quite green and lush, rather like the Serengeti. Open savanna with large numbers of animals, herd animals. So it was like a green paradise. Obviously, that's a pull factor for our ancestors. They were following these animals on their migrations. And so today it was quite a change, tens of thousands of years later, to go into desert and find that here, yet again, political upheaval is one of the greatest impulsors of human migration. So these are Syrian refugees who were fleeing the Syrian civil war. At that time, about 12 to 13 Syrians were displaced outside of Syria. As you all know, Syria is heating up again. Probably there's going to be other mass displacements happening if this continues. And these folks were picking tomatoes in the desert, basically renting out their bodies to farmers for very little money. Next image. I could not walk through Syria. Heading, my direction was generally towards Asia. I did not intend to walk through Europe. I simply don't have the time. It's too far. I walk about 20 to 25 kilometers a day. While I was walking through Turkey, major wars were breaking out on cities near the Turkish border. In this case, this was a city called Kobane, where I think something like 130,000 people stampeded over the Turkish border in the course of a few hours. This is them desperately pushing up against the barbed wire of the Turkish border. Again, a journey that's scientifically premised on following the first original human dispersal across the planet, kind of the first discovery of the world by ancient people, running again and again into forced migrations in the early 21st century. We're still doing it, folks. We're still moving around, often under tragic circumstances. Next image. Later in Turkey, after walking through Turkey, I had to cross the Caucasus, and this is one of my dear walking partners, Matu Chazal, a fantastic and brilliant documentary photographer, dressed here rather like, the Neolithic. He looks a bit like a caveman, Matu here. We were crossing the Caucasus in midwinter using a cargo animal, and Matu did not have warm enough clothing, so he basically found some scrap plastic in a dump, in a garbage bin, and wrapped it about himself. So modern adaptation to climates still goes on, even with modern Homo sapiens. Next image. From Turkey, I could not get permission to walk through Iran. Iran, has a pretty strict border control when it comes to people like me, that is journalists. So I had to veer north through Central Asia. So I walked through the stans, right? Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And this is a picture traversing the big steppes, the broad steppes of Kazakhstan, again with a pack animal. The foot crossing of Central Asia took 2.5 years. It's a vast, vast territory. And I tried my best, as I often do on this project, to follow ancient pathways. In this case, I was following the Silk Roads, right, that connected Asia to Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, going back 2,200 years. Next image. And this is coming into Afghanistan. These are the Hindu Kush Mountains. I crossed a very remote part of Afghanistan where pastoral nomadism is still, that economy is still going, this really ancient economy, one of the oldest dating back to the Neolithic, right? The domestication of animals. The people in this case were pushing around yaks, these very high elevation ruminants that do well up in, treeless, very cold zones, eating grass. And over those mountains behind them was Pakistan. So I crossed into northern Pakistan on my way to you folks, on my way to India. Next image. And there it is. That's India. That's walking through the Punjab after having crossed over the border with Pakistan. Quite a difference, huh? Going from icy mountains in Central Asia into the vast river plains and river watersheds of India, crossing 3 or 4 different big watersheds over the course, as I mentioned earlier, of about 4,000 kilometers. Next image. During the passage through India, one of the things that I focused on, so I'm a writer primarily. I do take photos and shoot video, but primarily I write. One of the things that struck me coming through northern India, where there is, as you all know, a paucity of early human fossils, the geology just does not favor the preservation of human fossil remains, although there are stone tools, amazing finds. One of the contemporary problems that I was struck with again and again, coming on foot, walking basically from Pakistan across northern India into the Bird's Head in northeast India and then into Burma, was the water crisis that strikes farmers in northern India. And so we did things, National Geographic and my partners at Esri and at Harvard produced storytelling maps, and this is one of them, describing the water crisis across India. Very complicated issue, as probably most of you know. Next image. And one thing I like to bring up in every time that I talk about the Out of Eden Walk project, and by the way, the Out of Eden means the anthropological Eden, the African Eden that we all walked out of at some point. If you go far back enough in your family tree, one of your ancestors walked this route that I've been walking. One of the things that I always bring up are walking partners, what I call walking partners. They're not just kind of local logisticians or fixers or translators or, problem solvers. They are co-equal storytellers. I walked with 9 across northern India, amazing people of their own right. Some of you might even have heard of some of them. One is Arti Kumar Rao, who's in this picture, who's a very amazing environmental photographer and writer. She just put out a book last year called Margin Lands about environmental crises through India. I was very, very lucky to walk with her, with Sid Agarwal, who's walked out the Ganga from sea to source, who's now running a nonprofit called Viditam, which encourages young Indians to get out and walk their rivers as a way to familiarize themselves with this vital, precious resource and to kind of live with the communities that live along India's rivers, and many others, journalists, educators, amazing folks. India was very, very rich experience for me. I learned a tremendous amount. It's like a walking academy for me. Next image. From India, as I mentioned, I walked into Burma, and then guess what? COVID erupted while I was in Mandalay in northern Burma. So what do? You're on foot across the world and a pandemic erupts and suddenly all the borders are closing, locking down. And I was basically trapped in Myanmar for months and months. And then to make matters worse, a coup erupted in Myanmar, as you all remember, in February 2020. The junta, the generals, overthrew the democratic government of Myanmar. And so not only was the border locked down because of pandemic controls, but the country started to erupt in violence and civil war. So for the first time I think this would have been, at this point, I've been walking about 6 years. I had to get on an airplane and fly ahead to hop over a danger zone in northern Myanmar. There was just no other way to keep going. So I flew into China and went to the nearest border of China to Myanmar, and then started walking again across China. And this is a woman who's a tea picker on a tea plantation in Sichuan. I've spent 2 years and 4 months walking almost 7,000 kilometers across China from southwest to northeast. It was the walk of a lifetime within this larger walk of a lifetime. That's the Out of Eden Walk. It was so amazing. I've been out of China for several months now, and I think I'm still processing it. Been to parts of China on foot that I think very few outsiders, even very few urban Chinese, have ever set foot. And it was quite a privilege. It's very humbling. Next image. So as I mentioned, I'm mainly a writer. And so the main kind of output of the Out of Eden Walk project is media, right? I have a National Geographic website, which stories are posted every week or two. They're multimedia, they're text driven, but they also have photos. They also have video. They focus on the people who I meet the way with farmers trying to with sustainable techniques in Uttar Pradesh. or a poet, who's walked along through Western China with me, and or a historian in China who talked about, change in China since the medieval times. Um, Another part of the project's output is educational. We do have tens of thousands of students across the world follow the storytelling in their classrooms. Harvard think tank at Harvard is one of our partners for that program. And we also do workshops. We did 6 workshops in northern India while I was walking through that. 3 of them were something called photo camp, which is giving cameras to young people to teach them how to document their own lives as a way of giving them confidence, self-confidence in their stories of their own biographies and their own communities. And then the other 3 were for Indian media workers to basically help them acquire some skills about how to do what I call slow journalism, right? The kind of journalism that I'm practicing, which is not breaking news, which is not trying to compete with, up to the moment news, but spending enough time with the people who live inside the headlines of the day to actually tell a nuanced, personal, emotional story that's hopefully deeper than just the superficiality of the media that comes out of our smartphones all the time. Next image. And so that's it. So here I am talking to you from Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and looking forward to continuing the journey in the New World. And probably will be walking, following this ancestral trail for another 3 years or so. And as some of you may know, the theories about human dispersal into the New World are changing. It used to be, back when I was in school, the focus was on land migration, land dispersal over Beringia, the Bering Land Straits, Bering Bridge. But more and more evidence is accumulating that at least a large component of it, or some component of it rather, was maritime, coastal dispersals using small canoes or what have you. And archaeological sites are pushing back the dates of these New World settlements by thousands and thousands of years. So that's about it. I'll stop here and be happy to answer any questions the best I can. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I wish I were there myself in Varanasi.
Right.
Thank you, Paul. Such an incredible journey, and we have been delighted to hear you. It was a great learning and experience. I am sure more we learn, more we have questions, and I'm sure all the audience have a lot of questions. Please raise your hand or type your questions in the chat box. Meanwhile, Professor Gyaneshwar has a question to you. I will start with that.
Okay.
So, as I said, what an incredible journey. And he asked, what do you think if a Stone Age person would think to do the same journey now? What he or she might have felt?
The first response to that is that I think a Stone Age person wouldn't be crazy enough to do this journey now. What I point out to my readers, and as all of you probably are well aware, our ancestors did the world in the kind of sustained, full-on march way that I'm walking. There was no reason to walk 20 kilometers a day unless you're fleeing enemies or you're trying to get out of an extreme climate situation. People inched along and basically exhausted resources in one valley and then inched along over a mountain to go to the next valley. So often moving maybe 1 or 2 kilometers a generation. So, this is a really good question because I've been trying to put myself into the mindset of Paleolithic people. And sometimes I think I can. Sometimes I think, okay, I'm kind of getting into the groove of sort of what it is to slow down my life, to listen, to look at a human pace, to absorb data through my body, the way our bodies are designed to, right? Rather than through these screens. It's been an amazing experience on those days when I feel that way. There's kind of a sense of kind of a combination of being hyper alert, like a hunter, switched on, your nerve endings are switched on. They have to be, right? You have to be listening for people. You have to be aware of what you're walking on. You have to be kind of like looking around for landmarks. So you're really, it's kind of the hunter mode. But at the same time, walking, as all of you know, also encourages kind of deeper reflection. Sort of this film of your life is starting always to unspool as you start walking. And so it's this interesting interior exterior kind of experience, something akin perhaps to pilgrimage. That might be the closest that I can get to what those ancestors were thinking as they were moving through landscapes themselves. Great question.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question, Rahul? Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. For such an enlightening talk. What a journey. You have had. I was just wondering. Could you get any kind of insights on how this ancient walking might have changed over the years, right, from your walking drive? I mean, how do you see this as a biologist? I mean, could you see any probably maybe some parts of the world might be fast walkers, or they might be walking like an ancient man or Neanderthals they would do. So what kind of a genetic predisposition as a biologist that you could equate to these kind of walking drives? Yeah, thank you.
Great question. Great question. And I need to think it, because, nobody's asked me this question before. I studied a little bit before I left on the paleoanthropology of human locomotion. And as you probably know, the adoption of footwear really changed the way we walk, right? People could do a heel strike much more easily than when they were walking barefooted or with very, thin kind of like sandals. And I think studies have been done with indigenous communities in many places of the world. One of them is in northern Mexico with a group of people called the Raramuri, who do these very long runs, sometimes barefooted, sometimes very thin sandals. And the way that those folks walk is really interesting. They basically kind of step down, as you know, on the front of the foot, not the back, because they don't have a big, thick shoe heel kind of protecting their heel bones. So I think, and when I was walking with pastoral nomads, again, probably the economy that's closest to a Neolithic kind of lifestyle, what I noticed too is fascinating is that they don't lift their feet very much. It's really fascinating. And this is just an anecdotal. I don't have data to support it. But, you're walking months with folks, so you tend to see them take tens of thousands of footsteps. They're very energy efficient. They don't kind of raise their feet very much. They don't kind of like march, it's this kind of shuffle. The hips move kind of a little bit back and forth. The feet are kind of skimming just barely off the surface of the desert. And I thought, I don't know. I mean, there are a few PhDs in this probably, but just kind of speaking as a non-expert, this is like what I would call like the endless horizon walk, where you can just walk and walk and walk and walk. And probably very few people do it these days, right? Because our walking patterns have been changed anatomically by the adoption of footwear. When did we adopt footwear has been a question that's been kind of a joke with my project. It's like, who cares, right? For the average reader, but for me, it's interesting. And, there's been, the information is so fragmentary that nobody really knows. But one of the funniest kind of paleoanthropological sites that I visited on the footwear front was there's a cave, Tianyuan Cave outside of Beijing, which held the remains of one person, a male, a young male, who was about, I think up to 40. So actually quite an ancient guy, not a young guy by these standards. He was 40,000 years old. And one paleoanthropologist studied his feet bones and noticed that the toes were squished together. They did not have this separation that people who spend their lives walking barefooted have. And so based on that kind of secondary, evidence, there's no direct evidence, he was suggesting that maybe that person had been wearing some sort of footwear, so maybe kind of skin wraps around his feet because it was a somewhat cooler climate. In which case, if you can believe it, and I think evidence is pretty slim, but he was hypothesizing maybe 40,000 years, the invention of footwear. I think the oldest shoe, by contrast, I think is in they pulled out of a cave in Armenia, and it's a leather artifact that I think is, I believe, 6,000 to 8,000 years old. Yeah, these are points that these are great questions because they're ones I think about all the time, and I don't have answers for.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Paul.
You're welcome.
but those people who moved along these trails or along these ways so many thousand years back, their walking was, or their migration was a kind of forced migration. They were forced by circumstances to move and change their places. And it was not a continuous journey like yours.
That's correct. Yeah,
And definitely, I mean, other circumstances like security problems and rulers, robbers, all these human interaction problems must have been very, very different than what they are at present. So in that context, would you like to comment something? Because their migration was in pieces, I guess. It must have taken several thousand years for moving one to, I mean, nobody would probably move in his own lifetime throughout the trail, part of trail, and generations. Ultimately, many generations, after many generations, somebody would make that journey.
that's absolutely correct, and that's what I was saying earlier. That this it's hard to get into the mindset of a Pleistocene person because I'm not doing what they did, nor can I. And I think it would be actually kind of foolish. Maybe somebody else could try, but I'm not hunting rabbits, right? Walking across the world. I'm not napping Flint. I'm stopping at convenience stores if I can find them to pick up a cappuccino. So I have I want to make this perfectly clear. I am not recreating the first human colonization of the earth. That is beyond our knowledge. As a lay person, I think we can hypothesize about what that was like.
Yep.
But
yep.
The psychology of moving through a world where destinations had not yet been invented, right? Mm-hmm. That's why we don't call it migration, right? Back then, we call it dispersal. But it's a certain way of being that, my friends, I think about almost every day, knowing I can never share it because it's gone. And it's so far gone that it's beyond any sort of wisp. Maybe there's some limbic memory, right? There's some kind of hum in our bones if you want to be, kind of spiritual about it. But I'm talking more about these moments of what human mind body interaction does, the thing that athletes experience, these kind of moments of euphoria. In terms of the actual mechanics of dispersal, I think I saw one study basically using geolocations of fossils in the same chronology or close to the same chronology, saying that, on average, if you kind of measure it just using raw mathematics from Ethiopia, from wherever, some really old, early anatomical modern human site in Africa to, say, the Arctic or the tip of South America, kind of the furthest horizon, maximum 2 kilometers a lifetime, right? So,
yeah.
Which absolutely true. I think it took people, even if you just look at the dating on the fossils that I started with, I started at a site that was 150,000 kbp. The oldest things that you find at the tip of South America, my finish line, are about 8,000. So do the math, right? That's a long time. Certainly not, to me in my lifetime, 15 years of walking continuously. It's a huge investment of my life, and it's long, but it's microscopic, and it's also highly artificial. So as a writer, I remind my readers in any story that and my stories aren't always about science. I do talk about archaeology often, but also talk about culture and music and language and war and gender issues, what have you. But when I do talk about the science of human dispersal and nomadism, I make it very clear that I am in no sense of the word, nor do I desire to dress up in skins and go out and with a spear. I mean, that maybe let some other person do that for TV, but that's not what I'm doing. Yeah.
So, do you think, because it needs a lot of courage and passion, one have to be very passionate and very dedicated in order to perform such journeys that you did. So, how it affected you before this journey and after this journey? What difference you find in yourself, your way of thinking?
Great. And it's one, of course, that I think about too, is like, how have I changed? I have to throw out a caveat, a warning that, so, I wasn't like working in an office or at a university, and then I just got this idea my friends, I started this when I was 50. So just so you know, so I didn't like have a midlife crisis. And the joke I make with my friends is like, I had choice between buying a convertible sports car or go walk the earth when you turn 50. It wasn't that at all, because number one, I was raised in a small village in central Mexico that wasn't even in the 20th century. It was more like 19th century. They were using animals like horses and mules to plow. Some of the neighbors were using kerosene lanterns for light at night. So I think from very early age, when I was like 5 or 6, that was the genesis of this project. I was already kind of moving in a time machine through my life. And then so I got into journalism, right? And I was based in Africa for a decade, but I had wonderful editors who allowed me to really focus like on one story for months. I'd say, hey, this story is worth it. It's important to Africans. Let's spend 6 months on it. So in a way, those 10 years in Africa were kind of like a warm up, like going to the gym, right? Intellectually, to kind of get ready. I didn't know it. I wasn't planning it. So combination of childhood in kind of an environment that would be very familiar to many of you if you kind of walk through villages in northern India. I felt really at home because I could talk about animals, I could talk about crops, to an intellectual development that also emphasized slowness, slowing down. And I think the word that you're getting at here that involves change, personal change, is patience. Being patient. This is a resource that's vanishing from the world in today's world of high technology, where we expect everything instantly, right? And attention spans are kind of going up in smoke. If it doesn't, media experts who like are in the information business say, the most you're going to get at a photo is like 2 seconds. And then the 16-year-old kid will swipe her thumb across the screen and you're gone, you're vanished. So I don't know, we're kind of at a new frontier about the human attention span. I don't know what's going to happen next, but this project has thrown me back into this older world that requires attentiveness, that requires focus, literally, so that you can get through your day, right? Because if you're not attentive, you step off a cliff or in front of a train or whatever, right? Or you don't hear somebody who's calling to you to say, hey, don't go there. So you have to be, attentive and switched on, but also patient. I think that would be the biggest gift. I've become a much more patient person than I was when I started. Another great question. Yeah, thank you.
Just wonderful hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you folks. I have more and more memories of Varanasi. Yeah.
Yeah. So Paul, our chat box is flooded with questions. I
know.
would request you to go through the chat box and maybe if you could briefly answer some of them. Like 2 of them are actually in the same questions from different persons. That your greatest motivation about your incredible work, that I'm going to read. You can answer this one first and then go one by one to all.
Okay. So Rahul, did you want to pick out some, or do you want me to try to like very quickly speed through them? Or what?
You can quickly answer all of them. Well, but my personal choice would be the. I can come it to later, but of course we all want to know what was your greatest motivation and how how you felt when you started this incredible walk.
Yeah. It was an idea that came out of a bit of frustration with the job that I was doing. So I was a foreign correspondent, right? So I was this white guy who was in Africa, not just in Africa, but I also got sent to wars. I was in Iraq, I was in Afghanistan by my newspaper. Um, and after doing that for a little while, number one, I kind of was just, I'm not any more self-aware than anybody, but I was just self-aware enough to know that, how privileged I was to kind of be jetting to these places and telling the stories of the people who live there, right? And then jetting away, right? Relatively quickly. Number one. And number two, as I was jetting to these different hotspots, I always was staring out the airplane window, wondering how many incredible human stories are passing under the wing of this aircraft that aren't being heard simply because of geography, or simply because of disempowerment, or simply because there's not a highway nearby, right? Or a train line or what have you. And yet I bet that those stories that are muted, passing under the airplane wing, that never get heard, are just as important as the story that I'm flying to. So that was there was this intellectual motivation based on years of working as a journalist to say, instead of staying on this merry-go-round of 24/7 news, I'm going to step off it and go the other direction and just slow down and see what happens, right? Slow journalism, the way, it comes from the idea of slow food, right? Slow food is prepared with love and care. The ingredients are nutritious, carefully chosen. It feeds you, not just your body, but your soul. That's the idea for the journalism that hopefully is coming out of this project, right? It takes longer, it takes the luxury of time. So it was an intellectual motivation, but it's turned into a much more deeply emotional one. I don't have the time to go into it on this call, but it's been one of the most emotionally rewarding stretches of my life. People ask me, "Aren't you lonely?" And I'm saying, "Are you kidding me?" It's the most social part of my entire life, because when you're walking the world, you're on stage, especially if you look like you, right? I mean, you're kind of a stranger, and you stand out, and you have to talk to people. You can't ignore people. So I have 10, 15, 20 conversations every day with strangers. There's a question there from Prash, I believe.
You already answered that.
Okay. Okay. Well,
And
you
there's
help.
a question.
Which the next one, Rahul? Which one?
Adrija Chaudhary is asking, how are you associating Paleolithic migration with your journey in the modern age? Have you been able to gather any significant insight to contribute to the several theories that come out of Africa migration theory? Which one do you agree with?
I read probably the same papers, although quite a few less. I just don't have the time than you do, Adrija. So, scientifically inclined readers say, "Hey, look, you started in 2013 when the knowledge set, the consensus was X, and now 5 years later it's changed because new data comes in. What are you going to do?" And I have to laugh and say, "What do you want me to do? You want me to go back and rewalk my route? Are you crazy?" It's no, because thank heaven science is a living, breathing thing, and thank heaven it's not dead. It's not locked away in an airless jar in a museum. That would be very depressing. So I present my walk as a moment in time with the best consensus knowledge that I can. Back when I started in 2013, if you all recall, back a decade or more ago, the basic data was saying about 60,000 years ago, there was a pulse, right? Some people called it the third wave migration, where people moved out of Africa. And there are all these hypotheses, right? Climate crises, a volcano erupting, changing, climates, blah, blah, blah. There's also kind of a little bit of a sea land bridge across the Gulf of Aden that allowed people to kind of hop across to Saudi. But it's now become clear that probably people left far earlier, right? At least 100,000, maybe even earlier. So I would say it's wonderful. I don't have like a pet theory, and my very kind of act of walking from town to town, whether it's in, South Korea or India or anywhere else, it doesn't really add too much to the scientific debate. This is more kind of an anecdotal, gathering experience for storytelling. All I can say is, and I'm being a little bit romantic here. I'm kind of being a little bit, this is not scientific, but after having walked this far, I can understand completely why there's a certain amount of unhappiness in the world, because I think we are walking machines, evolutionarily designed to move at 5 kilometers an hour. We are designed neurologically to absorb information at 5 miles an hour. Our bodies, our nerve endings are designed to do this. Our minds are designed to process it this way. No surprise why it feels good to go out and take a stroll, right? If you're stressed, what do? You go out and take a stroll and you feel better. And so that's one kind of anecdotal kind of revelation that seems to be very true as a result of all this walking that I've done.
Okay, there's plenty of more questions, but I'll quickly take you to a few of them because we have limited time. I won't take a lot of time of yours. There is one question from Bilal that you mentioned that our forefathers at some point migrated to Southern America in the last of your presentation.
Yeah.
And since it is surrounded by Andes and Peru, Quechua, so there must have been adaptations to overcome those environments. Do you think that the adaptation these at different mountain ranges were accumulated, or what, or was it different every time?
Oh, that's a great question, Bilal. That's a fantastic question that I think is, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear if you're involved in this quest, or if you know papers that address it. But this notion of what is lost through time and what has, how many times do we reinvent the wheel sort of question, right? Because it's not just these mountain ranges, but even moving north into Arctic zones, the invention of sewing, the invention of using, bone needles to make clothing that allows us to basically exploit these environments that were otherwise inaccessible to us because of cold. The eye of a needle was an amazing technological revolution for Homo sapiens. Did we carry that needle for 1,000 more generations after some people maybe went southward into hotter environments? I don't know. I think it's probably you can't generalize. Probably it's very site specific. But I think the most fantastic hypothesis that I heard was from a guy who was a paleoanthropologist at the Smithsonian, and I was asking him these questions about, like, how did we transmit information? How do we transmit knowledge? He said, Paul, one of the reasons he thought that we finally exploded out of Africa pretty quickly in the Pleistocene was that there are simply enough of us. There was simply enough of a population density of Homo sapiens on the landscapes to be able to communicate with each other and transmit cultural knowledge. And that before that, numbers were so low and so precarious that small groups of people might invent something like a needle or whatever, a certain kind of sophisticated flaking tool. But then they would die out and it would be lost. And then some other group, thousands of years later or many generations later would kind of stumble across it and reinvent it, and then it would die out again. So the notion that simple numbers is a key factor in transmitting and preserving knowledge is a really beautiful one. I'm a humanist, so I love people, and I like that hypothesis.
Thanks. One last question, and I will merge actually 2-3 questions into it.
Okay.
So, did you ever feel tired or at some point thinking of giving up due to language barrier or other barriers or your family obligations?
Yeah, good questions and normal ones to ask. Yeah, of course, I feel tired and sometimes discouraged. Strangely, and all of you who are scientists will get this, I think. It's less to do with physical exertion, like crossing a big mountain range or being stuck on one side of a big mountain range, because my project is Paleolithic in the sense that the seasons and the out of doors absolutely define my route and my timing. I can't, I have people say, when are you going to be in, Delhi? Can you be here next Tuesday? And I say, are you kidding me? Depends on how hot it is, how much it's raining, whatever. So it's not the physical part that kind of sometimes gets down. It's the intellectual part about writing. If I'm having difficulty writing what I hope to be good stories, I can get down like anybody else. Never enough, at least yet, to say I'm going to call it quits. But I do tell my readers over and over and over again that I reserve the right. I'm raising my hand here, kind of taking a vow that the tip of South America is the kind of symbolic endpoint of this project. But I reserve the right that when this project no longer becomes interesting, when it's no longer challenging intellectually, when I'm no longer learning new things, I reserve the right to say, I hear today, wherever this is, this latitude and longitude on my GPS is the finish line, and I stop it.
Okay,
and family.
Thank you, Paul.
Last one, family walk with me. So we stay in touch that way.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I thank you for this incredible and wonderful speech and this talk. It was amazing. The points you covered, the material you showed, your journey was such engaging and thoughtful. And we are so grateful that you shared your experience with us. Every slide was raising more and more intrigue, and we wanted to listen you forever, but time is the constraints. And seeing the number of questions, you can see that we are showered with positive feedbacks and more and more curiosity. But we have time constraints, so I will end up this meeting, and I greatly thank you and acknowledge your contribution for your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Rahul and everybody, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and it's an honor to be attending your conference. And good luck to all of you. And thank you for having me.
Okay, all the participants, with this, we have a final closing of INBIX ADNAT Conference 2020-24.
Great. Thank you all.
It was a great start and even great end of this conference. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.